And I can't tell you how excited I am to start our season. My name is Gary Levinson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth. And those of you who are new to these pre-concert talks, I'm always joined by someone who is an incredible aficionado and an expert in this music. But one of our very favorite people is Laurie Shulman, who is here today to open our season. So please help me welcome Laurie. Yay.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be back in North Texas on this glorious Saturday afternoon and a very, very special inaugural concert to our new season, which is Gary's 10th anniversary season as Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth.
Thank you.
And we all share a little bit of his reflected glory from the past decade of really splendid performances here. This afternoon will be no exception. If I'm not mistaken, you brought in the Diaz Trio your very first year.
Yes, I was very lucky that when I started here, I had wonderful relationships with some of the greatest chamber musicians and their personal friends. So I said, well, who is going to be the one string trio that not only is great, but also has played for many, many years? The Diaz Trio was our first trio in that concert.
And joining them on the second half will be a wonderful pianist, Angela Cheng. We have been trying to get her to come to this series for several years, and it just worked out. The fates fell into place, so we're delighted that she's making her CMSFW debut on this program.
Yeah, originally it was supposed to be in 2020, but you know what happened there. So fortunately, I'm stubborn enough to make her come every year until she said yes.
And we are just absolutely thrilled that people are coming out for more live events now. This is the stuff that fills our souls and makes life worth living. So thank you again for joining us at this inaugural concert. If you look at the program, you'll see we have a work by Schubert, a work by Beethoven, and then an all Mozart second half. Musicians would call this a meat and potatoes program, but this isn't just any meat. This is filet mignon, and the potatoes are pommes de terre gratin from the very best French restaurant, or perhaps a German or Austrian restaurant, given the fact that we have a German and Austrian program. This is music that I can only call delicious. This was so much fun for us to put together because the two of us know and love these works so well, and it will give us great pleasure to join you in hearing them in a little bit, but we're here now to tell you a little bit about them. One thing I would like to point out is that the Schubert that opens the program is in one movement. The Mozart that opens the second half is in two movements. The Mozart that concludes the second half is in three movements. And the Beethoven that concludes the first half is in four movements. So we have four very different takes on the so-called classical era, maybe straining the tiniest little bit towards the Romantic era, but still working within the framework of what we call multi-movement sonata form, at least when there's more than one movement. So we're going to hear a lot of sonata form this afternoon, but we're also going to hear some really superb melodies by some of the greatest melodists in the history of Western classical music. Let's start out with this early Schubert string trio. Now, every composer who strives to write for string quartet starts with the string trio because he or she is learning how to balance the voices before going to that stratosphere that Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven raised to such an elevated state within the realm of chamber music. We think of a chamber music ensemble. The classic one is the string quartet. The string trio is a proving ground, but for Schubert, it was also family time. Gary, you want to explain?
Well, first of all, in the age of specialization now in the 21st century, it's hard for us to imagine somebody who was such an incredible pianist and so somebody who wrote so much chamber music would still understand the string instruments so well. But Schubert did, because he would play string instruments just like Beethoven did, even though Beethoven is known to us as the great pianist. So in his home, he would have musicales, right? I mean, not the kind of musicales necessarily that would have 50 or 60 people there, but just for his family that would gather around in the music room and read things. And of course, his music, which is the ultimate in great melodies, would be written for that kind of a thing. So, maybe a lot of them would try things out and he might even correct them after it.
It was quite literally a family affair. Both his brothers played string instruments, and his father was also a string player. So they were able to put together a pickup string quartet and sight read through all sorts of wonderful music that already existed. Schubert was a generation younger than Beethoven and Mozart, but also the music that Schubert was writing himself. So this early string trio, one of two single movement string trios that survives from Schubert's hand, is treasured by string players. And without further ado, I'm going to give you a hint why. We're going to listen to our first example, which is the very opening of it, and you'll hear what a gifted songwriter Schubert was, because all of his string melodies also sing. Example 1, please. Two things I want to point out to you. One is that he repeats every melodic idea to kind of burn it into our ears. That will come back to us when we're listening to the development section. But also the phrases are very even and flowing and four-squared. This is classical writing at its finest.
Yeah, and I also think that in some ways, burn into your ears is a perfect metaphor, because the melodies are just so smiling. They're so sunny that if he didn't repeat them, they would go by so quickly that we probably wouldn't remember them. So he is the great songwriter, and he says, hey, let me restate that so you continue to smile through this trio.
One of the principles of classical writing in sonata form is that you want a strong, if you'll excuse the adjective, masculine first theme. This is what Robert Schumann called it. And then a softer, gentler, contrasting theme that could be construed as feminine. And Schubert gives us a textbook example of this in his second theme. May we hear the next example, please? So it definitely contrasted. It was smooth and flowing, but then he gives us a little bit of a surprise. We have a mini outburst there.
It's a conversation, isn't it? So the violin does that ascending arpeggio, and the other two instruments, I should say, really you could say argue with them. You know, they maybe that outburst is not so elegant, and then the violin in the next example does the same thing, where they finally agree.
We're going to move now to the Beethoven, which is a much larger scale work. This is a full 4-movement, multi-movement work. You're going to have a sonata form first movement, you're going to have a slow movement, you're going to have a scherzo trio, and a finale, which is usually a cross between rondo and sonata. Here again, Beethoven was honing his craft before he attempted a string quartet, which he did not do until his publication of Opus 18. This is from Opus 9. Gary, it's a work you have played.
Yeah, in fact, there's 3 of these gigantic Opus 9 trios, and all of them, the first thing I should say is they're quite lengthy, actually. And then the second thing you should know is that they're very virtuosic for 3 instruments. I have to tell you, the Opus 9 number 2, I've recorded actually, and I remember that my colleagues, all of whom were great virtuosos, they said, thanks a lot, now I have to practice this for 6 months. This is not, even though it's probably designed for the home musicale like Schubert, this is not music for your average amateur. It is very complicated musically, it's very complicated technically, and as you can see, it's quite a large work to undertake.
He tells us that it's important by opening with a slow introduction in unison, which is dignified, but it also has just a little hint of wit that gives us a sense of the activity that's going to come. And it's a bit of a tip of the hat to Franz Joseph Haydn, who was one of his teachers. Example 3, please. hope you were noticing after that unison opening that there's a lot of conversation again going on among the three parts. He's giving everyone a chance, and with those little da-da-dum that you heard in the cello part, he's also just making you crack just the littlest wee bit of a smile, because you know this is a precursor of much livelier music to come.
I think it's important for us to remember that the Beethoven with the wild hair and the shaking fist is not the Beethoven of Opus 9, number 1. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was a young man full of hope, and that's what this piece is all about.
My next example is from the development section of the first movement, which after the slow introduction is a sonata allegro. What I'd like you to be listening for is the equality of parts and the imitation that is once again taking place between and among violin, viola, and cello. Track 4, please. If we didn't know, we could almost imagine that that was a full quartet playing.
Yeah, and it's a very dramatic work where you're going between many different keys. This is the serious Beethoven.
Indeed. We're going to move now to the slow movement, which is in the unusual key of E major. That's not what we would expect from a trio.
Right. I think this is where we got to talk about the genius of Beethoven, and actually every single composer on this program. One of the things that you're going to get from a genius is no matter how practical they want to be about their compositions, they have surprising ways that their genius composers are going to take. And one of the things that they do is they use different key centers in order to make that clear. Nobody really knows why they go between different things, but we will talk actually later, in later concerts during this year, about how even early Beethoven always surprises us. Early Haydn does as well.
Yes, so the choice of E major is done for tonal contrast with the first movement. He's also giving us a contrast in character. We're going to have gently flowing triplets, and Beethoven, who is not generally considered as strong a melodist as Mozart or Schubert, is about as Schubertian as you could ask for in this slow movement. Let's hear track 5, please. This is music that requires very careful tuning among the three players, isn't it?
The intonation, I'm so glad you brought that up. When you listen to the Diaz trio play this, remember that they're playing on 18th century instruments with modifications. We all play with titanium strings. We all play with stuff that was not available. The strings were gut strings in Beethoven's time. And it was very, very difficult for him to actually imagine the kind of intonation that we can actually demand right now. The other thing is, I'd like you to pay attention to the intervals that Beethoven uses here. This starts out essentially with only the interval of a third, and then it graduates to a fourth and eventually to a fifth. Beethoven was an amazing composer when it came to the economy of his materials. He would start out with something very small in these slow movements and then expand gradually so the ear kind of got used to it while maintaining the line and the melody.
We're going to move on now to the scherzo trio, and specifically the trio. This is a movement that in classical form goes A, B, A. The scherzo repeats after you've heard the central contrasting trio section. My example is from that trio section because it shows us Beethoven's wit again. It's essentially a little bit like a galumphing German dance, which is not going to be so elegant as the Viennese waltz or even the Viennese Ländler. And it just captures Beethoven's lively sense of humor, and it's just elegantly written for strings. Let's hear track 6, please. You can practically hear or see the dancers kind of stomping their feet a little bit in this, can't you?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's really not an elegant dance. This is more of a country dance, isn't it? And it's not really, as we sometimes think of Beethoven writing for the kings and queens, this is really Beethoven writing for the people, and I think he enjoys it.
And concluding with an example from Beethoven's finale, I've chosen a section that is right before the recapitulation of the main rondo theme. It's very mysterious, and then all of a sudden the first violin bursts forth with this perpetual motion theme that opens the movement, and it's like an arrival home. It's like the sun just came out from behind the clouds. May we hear the next track, please?
Just like we talked about the intervals, actually, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So this is where he plays around with the D, which is the tonic of the entire section, and he goes to E flat, half step, and then to E natural, whole step. So he keeps moving that around, and then all of a sudden, completely new material.
And the net result is that it sounds really mysterious and unstable, and then he says, here we are, our arrival point. We know exactly where we are now, and it drives to just a delicious close. It's a really marvelous trio. All right, moving now to the second half of our program, we are also going to switch composers, and I thought I'd do a quick refresher. If you look in your program, actually you'd have to go to the program notes, but I always say Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Most of you probably are more familiar with Amadeus because of both the Broadway play and the film, but in fact, look at the way Mozart most frequently signed his name. And this is the reason that most publications in the scholarly world have adopted Amadeus instead of Amadeus. So that's just by way of explication. He only actually used the word Amadeus when he was joking to a cousin or something like that.
Also, because he had how many names besides Amadeus? Like four names?
There are several of them.
4 or 5 names?
Because you got named for your saint's day that you were born on and who your maternal grandfather was. And he probably had 4 Christian names before the surname Mozart. Exactly. Yes. At any rate, we are opening the second half with a Mozart Violin Sonata. This is one of an early series of sonatas that are known as the Palatinate Sonatas because they were dedicated to the wife of the Elector Palatine. He and his wife were great patrons of music. These sonatas are important because they're the first ones in which Mozart really gave equal time to the violin and the piano. If you can read this early edition, I'll translate. It says, Grand Sonata, grand, large sonata, arranged for clavecin, meaning harpsichord, or pianoforte, with accompaniment of an obbligato violin. So the pianist was the star, the keyboardist was the star, and the obbligato violin was sort of decorating around, but you could play these pieces for piano alone and it would have been okay. Not in this sonata, and that's what makes it so special, is this very intricate dialogue that is constantly going on. Let's hear the beginning. This would be track 8 of the first movement of the sonata. They're absolutely equal partners, and it's a very playful back and forth in their conversation. But you could also hear little hints of the kind of concerto-like figuration in the piano part that is sort of a foreshadowing of what we're going to get a lot more of in the piano quartet that concludes the program. Okay, moving on to the second movement. Remember I said we had a 2-movement work in here. I believe all of the Palatinate sonatas are in 2 movements. 3 movements was not yet the norm for a sonata in the early classic.
Perhaps if it was supposed to be played by an amateur violinist, it would have been a great tax, technically speaking, for control and everything else to give someone 3 or 4 movements to learn.
So this next example is from the second movement, which is a rondo, and every time he states the rondo theme, he decorates it and varies it a little bit. This is part of Mozart's genius. Track 9, please. Gary, let's talk about this minore section, where he goes briefly to minor mode, which would be a standard thing for a composer to do, but Mozart handles it a little bit differently.
Yeah, when we're in school, we're always taught that Mozart is the great epitomist of Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. But in this case, I think this is very much born in the opera world, where this is just kind of a cloud. It's a dark cloud. It's not true storm, and it's not true stress. It's just a wonderful balancing act between the gorgeous smiling melodies that we just heard, and then something maybe slightly more serious, but not at all tragic.
It's much more subtle than Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. It came out of a literary movement in German literature in the 1770s. Haydn actually wrote a number of pieces that are associated with this musical movement, less so in Mozart. Perhaps the other piano quartet. Yeah. The G minor, the first movement, is a good example of that in Mozart. But here it's done with finesse and elegance, and it's just a slight shadow, and you know that the sun is going to come out again. All right, we move now to the crowning glory of this afternoon's program, which is the Piano Quartet, Koelschel 493, the second of 2 piano quartets that Mozart wrote. The image on the screen is a very famous portrait of the Mozart family. The mother, whose portrait is on the back wall, had died in Paris in 1778. That's why she's not depicted in the picture. And Mozart's there with his sister playing 4-hand music. And if you look at the positioning of your hands, you understand why this was a way that young people in the 1770s and 1780s could flirt with each other, because this was otherwise forbidden behavior. But Gary, can you talk about Mozart and the piano quartet, a genre that really did not exist before him?
Indeed. One of the things that is amazing for us, if you just work backwards and you think of the great piano quartets of the 19th century, the Brahms and the Schumann, they owe a debt of gratitude to Mozart. And I think in some ways, because Mozart loved the viola, and naturally the viola would star in a string quartet, the piano quartet kind of combined the practical and the creative. So practical being the pianist, Mozart, would write quite a few pieces because he wanted to get hired, and he wanted to make sure that he continued to make some kind of money. And with the other string instruments, rather than just support and not give them much to do, the music is just so spectacular that he does pass it around to all the string instruments as well as the piano.
There are no real precedents for Mozart's 2 piano quartets. The other pieces that might have employed 4 instruments were still using the cello as if it were a bass viol and just anchoring the bass line, but it is a real participant with the viola and the violin in the musical fabric of this wonderful quartet. Let's listen to an example from the first movement. You'll hear the shared material among the players, but you're also going to hear hints that the piano is going to take a more front and center role a little bit later on. Track 10, please. This is the opening of the Mozart Piano Quartet. So when the piano takes over the melody there, it's in dialogue with the three strings, but it's ornamenting and it's already saying, hey, look what I can do. And those fingers are starting to fly. They're just getting warmed up.
Indeed.
So one of my favorite passages in all of 18th century chamber music is the development section of this first movement. I've mentioned this in my program notes. He goes through an astonishing series of changes of keys in a very short time. We don't have time to listen to the whole passage, but I have excerpted a small section of it so that you can follow these amazing modulations. Track 11, please.
So 3 key centers, right?
Well, there were actually four there,
Four?
and the passage that follows,
counting
where
that
I
one.
cut off the example, goes on for a few more. It just changes the figuration. And I didn't want to steal the thunder of the wonderful live performance that we're going to be hearing very shortly. My next example is from the Larghetto, the slow movement, and this is another chromatic passage in the strings that kind of foreshadows where Mozart is reaching into deeper emotional territory and sort of hinting at the kind of angst that would preoccupy so many composers of the Romantic era.
Yeah, and the thing is that the Romantic era probably expanded the entire kind of structure of this, but what's beautiful about this particular quartet is it gives you a little bit of everything, but it doesn't make it into a 45-minute long work.
Yes, it's
Never too much. It leaves you, what is it, wanting more? Is that correct?
It's amazingly concise, and I can virtually guarantee that it will also leave you with big grins on your faces at the conclusion. But right now, let's listen to this passage from the Larghetto. This is example 12, please. Another reason I selected this example is that it's one of the rare places in this quartet where the piano is in the background in a really subservient role, just filling in the harmonies and letting the strings explore the full sonority and richness that they can each get.
We talked about intervals before. We should talk about what does a chromatic scale going down mean? And I'm convinced that Mozart knew first and foremost that when you have a chromatic scale going down, it's descending into a different world. For example, Beethoven, not to go off on a tangent, Beethoven did that in Leonora 3, where you're descending physically in the opera, you're descending from the surface into a dungeon. So here you're descending from the sunny world of Mozart into something maybe a little bit more different, and then you find yourself in a completely different key.
I would like to just interpolate one observation prior to going to our final example. We have in the tech room today John Knuckles, who's been with the Modern for a long time but has returned, and we're delighted to have him back. Thank you very much, John.
Welcome back, John. We missed you.
So my last example is from the finale, and this is where Mozart really lets the piano take off and sow its wild oats, if you will. He was obviously writing for himself, and I would like to point out that for a couple of the piano concerti, which contain his finest keyboard writing, he would arrange the concerto for a mini orchestra that essentially consisted of a string quartet to be performed in a private salon with one of his gifted pupils. That's what this finale feels like, even though it's a string trio rather than a full quartet supporting the piano, because you will hear figuration in the excerpt that I've clipped for you that is so much like things that we adore in his piano concerti. It is totally irresistible, and it is extraordinarily difficult to play this music with an even touch and with beautiful phrasing shapes. And I heard Angela Chang in rehearsal before. We are in the expectation of a truly superb performance this afternoon. Let's listen to the last example with this concerto-like figuration that culminates in a quasi-cadenza. Number 13, please. Now, wouldn't you have thought, if you just heard that, you tuned into it on the radio or something, that it was one of the piano concerti? That's really what it sounds like. It's great fun to listen to, and as I said, might be meat and potatoes, but this is perfectly cooked filet mignon with pomme de terre au gratin from the very, very best restaurant, and I hope that you all thoroughly enjoy this afternoon's performance with the Diaz Trio and Angela Chang. Thank you very much for being here, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.